The polished marble floors of Hampton Regal Hotel's lobby gleamed under crystal chandeliers as Marcus Green stepped through the revolving doors at exactly 2:15 p.m. His simple navy blazer and worn leather briefcase drew immediate attention from the staff behind the mahogany reception desk. Karen Whitmore, the afternoon manager, watched him with narrowed eyes as he approached. "Excuse me," she called out before Marcus could reach the counter. "I don't think you belong here." Marcus paused, his dark eyes scanning the opulent surroundings where his company had booked 300 rooms for next week's corporate retreat. The irony wasn't lost on him that he stood in a space his $10 million contract had helped maintain. A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth as he adjusted his briefcase strap. "I believe I do," he replied calmly. Karen's expression hardened. Behind her, guests in designer suits moved freely through the lobby without a second glance from staff. The contrast was stark and deliberate. Marcus had witnessed this theater before, but today felt different. Today, he had the power to change the script. You'll find out soon enough what happens when assumptions meet reality, he murmured to himself, approaching the reception desk with measured steps. Marcus moved toward the reception counter with practiced composure, his footsteps echoing softly against the Italian marble. The young receptionist, Sarah Chen, glanced up from her computer screen with a forced smile that barely concealed her discomfort. "Good afternoon," Marcus said, placing his briefcase carefully on the counter. "I need to review the arrangements for the Green Tech Solutions corporate event next week." Sarah's fingers hesitated over her keyboard. She glanced nervously toward Karen, who had positioned herself within earshot, arms crossed and watching every interaction like a hawk studying prey. Could you provide some identification first?" Sarah asked, her voice uncertain. Marcus noticed how she hadn't asked the elderly white gentleman ahead of him for any credentials beyond his name. The man had walked away with his keycards and a warm smile from the staff. The double standard hung in the air like expensive perfume, cloying and impossible to ignore. "Of course," Marcus replied evenly, producing his driver's license. Karen stepped closer, her heels clicking against the marble with military precision. "Sarah, make sure you follow all verification protocols for situations like this." Her emphasis on the last words carried unmistakable meaning. The other guests in the lobby began to take notice. A well-dressed couple near the concierge desk whispered to each other, their eyes darting between Marcus and the growing tension at reception. Marcus felt the weight of their stares, but maintained his dignified posture. "I'll also need to see a credit card," Sarah continued, following Karen's pointed look. "And perhaps some documentation proving your ability to cover the charges." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "For reviewing existing reservations." "Hotel policy," Karen interjected sharply. "We've had issues with people claiming to represent companies they don't actually work for." The accusation landed like a slap. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket, retrieving his black American Express Centurion card. The distinctive weight of the metal card caught the light as he placed it on the counter. Sarah picked it up, examining it with exaggerated scrutiny. "We'll need to verify this isn't stolen," she said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. In his peripheral vision, he noticed a young black woman in a business suit at a nearby seating area, her phone discreetly angled toward the reception desk. She was recording. Karen moved closer still. "Sir, I'm going to need you to provide additional forms of identification. We've had several incidents recently with people using fraudulent credentials." "What kind of incidents?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the building frustration. "The kind that happen when people try to access services they can't afford," Karen replied with a thin smile. The conversation was attracting more attention now. A family with teenagers stopped their conversation to watch. An older businessman paused his phone call. The lobby's atmosphere shifted from refined luxury to uncomfortable spectacle. Marcus pulled out his phone, ostensibly checking messages but actually beginning to record audio. He had learned long ago that documentation was the only weapon against institutional prejudice. "I understand your concern for security," he said carefully. "However, I'm simply here to discuss arrangements that have already been finalized and paid for." Karen's laugh was sharp and humorless. "That's what they all say." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Marcus felt the familiar burn of injustice rising in his chest, but he had learned to channel that fire into something more powerful than rage. He had learned to wait. Behind the reception desk, Sarah's computer screen displayed the GreenTech Solutions account details, including the substantial deposit and Marcus's name as the primary contact. But Karen's presence seemed to blind her to what was right in front of her. "Sir," Karen announced, loud enough for the entire lobby to hear, "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside while we verify your credentials." Marcus studied her face, memorizing every detail of this moment. Soon, very soon, she would remember this conversation very differently. The humiliation began with surgical precision. Karen gestured to the hotel's security guard, a burly man named Pete, who approached with obvious reluctance. "Pete, please ensure this gentleman understands our verification process," Karen said, her voice carrying across the marble expanse like a judge pronouncing sentence. The lobby fell silent, except for the soft jazz playing overhead. Marcus felt every eye in the room fixed on him as Pete positioned himself uncomfortably close. "Sir, I'm going to need to see proof that you have at least $50,000 available in your account before we can discuss any reservations," Karen declared. The number was arbitrary and everyone knew it. A collective intake of breath rippled through the watching crowd. Even Pete shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the cruelty of the demand. Marcus stood perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back in a pose that radiated quiet dignity despite the attack on it. "That's an interesting policy," he said softly. "I don't recall seeing it published anywhere." "It's for high-value reservations involving certain demographics," Karen replied, her words carefully chosen, but their meaning crystal clear. An elderly white woman near the elevator gasped audibly. The young black woman who had been recording stood up, her phone now openly filming. Several other guests began reaching for their own devices. "Ma'am, this is wrong," the young woman called out, her voice cutting through the tension. Karen whirled around. "Excuse me? I said this is wrong. I've been staying in hotels my entire life, and I've never seen anyone asked to prove they have $50,000 in their account just to check on a reservation." Marcus felt a surge of gratitude towards this stranger who had found her voice when his own measured silence served a greater purpose. He nodded slightly in acknowledgement, filing away her courage for later recognition. "Miss, please don't interfere with hotel business," Karen snapped. "This became my business the moment you decided to humiliate this man in public." The woman replied, her phone steady. Other guests began murmuring agreement. A businessman ended his call to watch the confrontation. The atmosphere in the lobby shifted from uncomfortable observation to active witness. Marcus reached into his briefcase and withdrew his phone, sending a quick text to his assistant. "Emergency board meeting needed. Hampton situation escalating as predicted." "Are you contacting someone to help you pay?" Karen asked mockingly. "I'm documenting this conversation," Marcus replied calmly. "I understand the importance of having accurate records." The words carried a weight that made Karen pause, but her momentum carried her forward into deeper trouble. "Sir, I don't appreciate threats," she said. "I haven't made any threats," Marcus replied. "I'm simply a guest trying to review his company's reservation while being subjected to policies that seem to apply selectively." Our policies apply to everyone equally. Karen insisted, but her voice wavered slightly. Do they? Marcus asked quietly. Because I watched 3 people check in ahead of me without being asked for financial verification, additional identification, or proof of their worthiness to be here. The truth of his observation settled over the lobby like a heavy blanket. Even Karen's supporters among the staff began looking uncertain. Marcus continued, his voice never rising above conversational level. I'm beginning to understand why my colleagues warned me about the culture at this establishment. It was a gentle warning shot, the first hint that this encounter might have consequences beyond the moment. But Karen, emboldened by her position and blind to the danger, pressed forward toward the cliff's edge. The situation careened toward chaos with the inevitability of a landslide. Karen, sensing challenge to her authority, decided to escalate rather than de-escalate. Security, I need you to escort this gentleman to the back office for further verification, she announced, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Pete hesitated. Ma'am, he hasn't done anything. He's disrupting our normal operations and making other guests uncomfortable. Karen interrupted. The young woman with the phone laughed bitterly. He's making guests uncomfortable. Lady, you're the one making everyone uncomfortable. Her comment sparked murmurs of agreement from the growing crowd of observers. What had started as a private humiliation was now public theater, and the audience was choosing sides. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with being othered, being made spectacle. But this time, he also felt something else. The quiet power of knowing that justice was a phone call away. I'll comply with your request, he said calmly, but I'd like to make one phone call first. You can make calls from the office, Karen replied dismissively. Actually, I think I'll make it now. Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. You cannot conduct business in our lobby, Karen protested. This isn't business, Marcus said as the phone began to ring. This is insurance. The word hung in the air ominously. Karen's confidence flickered for the first time, but her pride prevented retreat. Elizabeth, Marcus said when the call connected, I need you to contact the Hampton Hotel's board of directors immediately. We have a situation that requires their immediate attention. Sir, end that call right now, Karen demanded. Marcus ignored her. Yes, I'm at the Hampton Regal in Manhattan. The situation we discussed in our contingency planning is currently in progress. The lobby had gone completely silent, except for Marcus's side of the conversation. Even the jazz had stopped, as if the hotel itself was holding its breath. Who exactly are you calling? Karen asked, her voice losing some of its earlier authority. Marcus ended the call and looked directly at her. My attorney. The word attorney rippled through the crowd like electricity. Karen's face went slightly pale, but she had committed to her course of action and couldn't find an exit ramp. I don't care who you called, she said, but her voice betrayed her growing uncertainty. You still need to comply with our verification process. Of course, Marcus agreed. I'm very interested to see how this process works. At that moment, the hotel's general manager, Robert Chen, emerged from the elevator, drawn by reports of a disturbance in his lobby. He surveyed the scene. A well-dressed black man surrounded by security and staff, dozens of guests watching with phones recording, and his afternoon manager standing at the center of it all, like a conductor before an orchestra about to play a very different tune than she expected. What's going on here? Robert asked. Karen straightened, sensing reinforcement. Sir, this gentleman is claiming to have a corporate reservation, but he's been unable to provide adequate verification of his ability to pay for it. Robert looked at Marcus, taking in his composed demeanor and expensive briefcase. Something in the man's bearing suggested this situation was more complicated than it appeared. What company? Robert asked. Green Tech Solutions. Marcus replied calmly. Robert's face went completely white. He knew that name. He knew exactly how much money that name represented in their hotel's accounts. "Sir," Robert said carefully to Marcus, "perhaps we could discuss this in my office?" "I think we can discuss it right here," Marcus replied. "Transparency seems appropriate at this point." The clock on the wall showed 3:47 p.m. In 13 minutes, Marcus's world and theirs would change forever. At exactly 4 p.m., Robert Chen's phone erupted with the harsh electronic bleating that hotel executives dreaded most, the emergency tone reserved for calls from corporate headquarters. "Robert," came the crisp voice of Victoria Hampton, CEO of Hampton Hotels International. "Why am I receiving reports that you're currently in the process of humiliating Marcus Green?" The name hit Robert like a physical blow. Every drop of blood drained from his face as he looked across the lobby at the man standing calmly beside the reception desk, surrounded by increasingly agitated staff and recording guests. "Marcus Green," Robert repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "CEO of Green Tech Solutions," Victoria continued, her tone glacial. "Your largest corporate client. The man personally responsible for $10 million in annual revenue for your property specifically." Karen, still standing near Marcus, heard the name and felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The briefcase that had seemed shabby now looked expensive. The simple blazer now looked bespoke. The man she had spent the last hour humiliating was not just any guest. He was the guest. "I can explain," Robert began. "You can explain to the board of directors," Victoria cut him off. "Mr. Green's assistant has already contacted our legal department. Did you know that 12 people are currently live streaming this incident? Did you know that the hashtag #HamptonRacism is trending on Twitter? Did you know that our stock price has dropped 3% in the last 20 minutes? Marcus pulled out his business card and placed it gently on the reception counter. The simple white card bore the Green Tech Solutions logo and his name, Marcus Green, Chief Executive Officer. Sarah Chen, the receptionist, picked up the card with trembling fingers. Her computer screen still showed the Green Tech account, with Marcus's name prominently displayed as the primary contact for their $2.3 million retreat booking. "Oh my God!" Sarah whispered. The words carried across the marble lobby like a death knell. The crowd of watching guests pressed closer, sensing the dramatic turn they had been waiting for. Karen stared at the business card as if it were a snake about to strike. That can't be right." Marcus smiled for the first time since entering the hotel. It was not a kind smile. "Elizabeth," he said into his phone, "please cancel the Green Tech corporate retreat, effective immediately, and initiate withdrawal proceedings for all Hampton Hotel properties from our approved vendor list." "Sir, wait." Robert Chen stepped forward, panic evident in his voice. 300 rooms, 7 nights, full catering package, plus ancillary services. Marcus continued calmly. "I believe the total value was just over $10 million this fiscal year alone." The number hung in the air like a death sentence. Karen began to understand the magnitude of her mistake. She had not just insulted a guest, she had destroyed her hotel's most profitable relationship. "Mr. Green," Robert said desperately, "surely we can resolve this misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Marcus turned to face him fully. "Your manager spent the last hour demanding I prove I belong in a hotel that I essentially help keep in business. She required financial verification that your own policies don't mandate. She called security to intimidate me. She publicly questioned my creditworthiness and my character. Which part of that would you call a misunderstanding?" The crowd murmured agreement. The young woman who had first spoken up shouted, "Tell him, sir!" Marcus nodded toward her in acknowledgement. Your staff created a hostile environment based solely on their assumptions about who I am and what I represent. They saw a black man in a simple suit and decided I didn't belong in their space. But sir, Karen said desperately, if you had just told us— Told you what? Marcus's voice cut through her protest like steel. That I shouldn't be judged by the color of my skin? That I have the same right to respectful service as any other human being? That your policies should apply equally regardless of race? Karen fell silent, finally understanding that every word from this point forward would only deepen her grave. Marcus turned back to his phone. Elizabeth, also contact the N28CP Legal Fund and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. I think they'll be very interested in Hampton Hotel's customer service protocols. Robert Chen felt his career imploding in real time. Victoria Hampton was still on his phone, and he could hear her typing furiously in the background. Mr. Green. Robert tried once more. Please allow us to make this right. Marcus considered this for a moment, his finger hovering over his phone. The lobby held its collective breath. Tell me, Marcus said finally, how exactly do you make right a system that allows employees to humiliate guests based on racial profiling? How do you fix a culture that assumes black people don't belong in luxury spaces? Robert had no answer because there was no good answer. The damage was systemic, institutional, and now devastatingly public. Marcus pressed another button on his phone. The live stream that had been running for the past 45 minutes ended with 847,000 viewers and counting. The reckoning came swiftly and without mercy. By 6 p.m. that evening, the video of Marcus's humiliation had been viewed over 2 million times across multiple platforms. Justice for Marcus trended nationally, with celebrities, politicians, and civil rights leaders sharing the footage and demanding accountability. Karen Whitmore was terminated immediately, her access cards deactivated before she could even clear out her desk. The security guard, Pete, who had been reluctant to participate in the harassment, kept his job but received mandatory sensitivity training. Sarah Chen, the receptionist, was suspended pending review of her conduct. Robert Chen faced a different fate. Though not terminated, he was demoted to assistant manager at a Hampton property in suburban Cleveland, his salary cut by 60%. The board's message was clear. Tolerance for discrimination would destroy careers. But the corporate consequences extended far beyond individual punishments. GreenTech Solutions' withdrawal from Hampton Hotels triggered a cascade of cancellations as other minority-owned businesses and organizations pulled their events in solidarity. The hotel lost $47 million in bookings within the first week. Hampton Hotel's stock price plummeted 8% in 3 days. The company's diversity and inclusion officer, who had been warning about inadequate training protocols for months, was suddenly given unlimited budget and authority to overhaul the entire system. Victoria Hampton herself appeared on CNN, ABC, and Fox News, publicly apologizing to Marcus and announcing a $50 million initiative to retrain staff across all Hampton properties. The interview where she broke down while describing the video had 23 million views. Marcus, meanwhile, became the face of dignified resistance to corporate racism. Speaking requests flooded in from universities, corporations, and civil rights organizations. Harvard Business School invited him to deliver their annual ethics lecture. The NAACP honored him at their national convention. But perhaps most importantly, the incident sparked genuine change within the hospitality industry. The American Hotel and Lodging Association implemented new guidelines specifically addressing racial bias in customer service. Training programs that had been considered nice to have became mandatory at properties across the country. Karen Whitmore found herself unemployable in the hospitality industry. The video of her demanding Marcus prove his financial worthiness followed her to every interview. She eventually moved to a different state and took a job in retail, where her past followed her like a digital scarlet letter. 3 months later, Marcus received a handwritten letter from Sarah Chen. She had completed a comprehensive training program on unconscious bias and was working at a different hotel. Her letter was a genuine apology, acknowledging her complicity in the system that had made Marcus's humiliation possible. Marcus wrote back, encouraging her growth and offering her a second chance at dignity. The young woman who had first spoken up during the incident, Keisha Williams, was contacted by Marcus's company and offered an internship. Her courage in that moment had launched her own career in corporate advocacy. But the story's most powerful outcome was invisible to cameras and social media. Across the country, hotel staff began questioning their own assumptions about who belonged in their lobbies. Training sessions that had once been pro forma became genuine conversations about bias, dignity, and justice. 6 months after the incident, Marcus returned to the Hampton Regal for the first time. The lobby looked exactly the same, but everything else had changed. The staff greeted every guest with the same professionalism they showed him. The policies that had once been applied selectively were now consistently enforced for everyone or no one. Marcus stood in the same spot where Karen had first told him he didn't belong. The irony was complete. By trying to exclude him, she had forced the system to include everyone. Standing before a packed auditorium at the National Urban League's annual conference, Marcus reflected on the lessons that emerged from those 45 minutes in a hotel lobby. "I didn't choose to become a symbol that day," he said, his voice carrying easily to the back of the room. "I was simply trying to check on my company's reservation. But when systems of discrimination reveal themselves so clearly, we have a choice. We can look away, or we can force those systems to confront their own contradictions." He paused, looking out at faces that reflected his own experience of being underestimated, overlooked, and othered. "The power I used that day wasn't really mine. It belonged to every person who had been told they didn't belong, every professional who had been questioned unfairly, every human being who had been diminished by someone else's prejudice. I was simply in a position to focus that collective power into a single moment of accountability." Marcus described the $2 million fund he had established to train hospitality workers on unconscious bias, the scholarship program for young people entering hotel management, and the ongoing partnerships with civil rights organizations to monitor progress across the industry. "Real change doesn't happen in the moment of confrontation," he continued. "It happens in the months and years that follow, when institutions decide whether to learn from their failures or repeat them. Hampton Hotels chose to learn. Other organizations can make the same choice." He shared letters from hotel workers who had attended the new training programs, from managers who had revised their policies, from guests who no longer feared being profiled when they walked into a lobby. The goal was never to destroy anyone or any company. Marcus said, "The goal was to transform a moment of injustice into a foundation for justice, to turn humiliation into education, to ensure that what happened to me would never happen to anyone else." In the audience, several hotel executives took notes, knowing their own policies would be scrutinized when they returned to work. Marcus concluded with words that would be quoted in diversity training sessions across the country. "Dignity is not a privilege to be granted or withdrawn based on someone's comfort with our presence. It is a right that belongs to every person who walks through any door in America. When we protect that principle for the most vulnerable among us, we protect it for everyone." The standing ovation lasted for 4 minutes and 37 seconds. But the real applause would come in the form of policies changed, biases confronted, and young people inspired to demand better from the institutions that served them. As the audience rose to leave, many approached Marcus not for autographs or selfies, but to share their own stories of discrimination and dignity. Each conversation was a reminder that his experience in the Hampton Regal lobby was not unique, but that his response to it could be. "The next time you witness injustice, you have a choice," Marcus said to the young activists who lingered after his speech. "You can be a bystander, or you can be a force for change. You don't need to be a CEO to have power. You just need to be human enough to recognize when that humanity is under attack. One young woman asked what they should do if they didn't have Marcus's resources to fight back. "Use what you have," he replied. "Your voice, your phone, your refusal to accept unacceptable behavior. The most powerful tool any of us possesses is our unwillingness to let injustice become normal." As Marcus walked out of the auditorium, he passed beneath a banner that read, "Justice delayed is justice denied." But that afternoon had proven something different, that justice applied to one person can become justice available to all. The question now was not whether discrimination would continue to exist, but whether institutions would continue to tolerate it. Marcus had proven that the cost of tolerance was becoming too high to pay. Whether they chose to learn that lesson was up to them. Every person in that auditorium carried the power to teach it. "Remember," Marcus had said, "dignity cannot be purchased, but justice can always be fought for." In a world where being underestimated had become his greatest advantage, Marcus Green had transformed a moment of humiliation into a movement of hope.